When I was a kid, I saw a movie. It was an old science fiction movie made in the 1950s called The Blob, starring the great actor Steve McQueen. Perhaps you've seen it. It scared the bejesus out of me. Like an asteroid lands in a field outside some little town in America, and this sort of soupy, blobby biological form emerges. I can even remember like this shocking scene when this like old farmer goes out and like pokes it with a stick, and I think it climbs up on his arm, and then you see him like sort of run. It's in the middle of the night. He's running across the street, sort of captured by the headlights of some car, and he's got this thing crawling up his arm. Actually, I'm getting scared now as I talk about it. The Blob is a fascinating science fiction story because it does not bring us the sort of big-eyed alien grays. It doesn't bring us like the little green men. It doesn't even bring us the sort of tentacled creatures that we're so familiar with. It's just a blob it's like a gigantic biological cell that keeps sort of transforming and growing larger and larger as it feeds on energy and so forth. This idea of life from another planet really got under my skin when I was a kid, and it remains a fascinating topic for many of us. It raises the question, could life have come from another planet? Life originated on a completely different world and just traveled here, like sort of hitchhiking on an asteroid or a comet or something, landed here, billions of years ago, and what we have now ourselves maybe is the result of that. And could that happen again? Could that still be coming our way? This is the idea called panspermia. And no, it's not the porno you're thinking of. Get that out of your deviant mind. Panspermia, which means, the seeds of life are everywhere, is a doctrine that goes way back to the ancient world, but it's getting a fresh look in the last few years. So today, on Professor Asma's Guide to Unusual Knowledge, we're going to be looking at panspermia. Welcome. There seems to be three possible ways that life could have arose on Earth. One is what we call abiogenesis, which means that life emerged from non-life chemical ingredients. So inorganic chemicals that were here just by pure geology somehow came together with water and heat and energy and started to create biological, organic structures and molecules and eventually organisms. So that's one view, abiogenesis. Life emerged spontaneously from non-life ingredients. The second possibility is this panspermia that I'm talking about, which is life was sort of hitchhiking here on some asteroid or other. That view, I think, is getting a fresh look. But also there's a third possibility. This is the one that's particularly fun and more speculative, and that would be directed panspermia, which is that other civilizations might actually be directing the elements or ingredients of life out into the solar system or out into other galaxies and basically delivering life to other worlds. This is the stuff of science fiction, and I think many of you will agree with me that it's incredibly fun to speculate on not just the idea of traveling from other worlds on asteroids, but also the idea of a sort of speculative evolution. Now, my friend Paul Giamatti, many of you know, is a great devotee of science fiction, and he has been recommending to me this book by Olaf Stapledon, written in the 1930s, and I'm finally reading it, so thank you, Paul, for the recommendation. It just takes me about 5 years to get around to something that's recommended to me. And in this book, it's an amazing story. I'm just sort of at the very beginning of it, but it's a kind of speculative evolution of human beings, sort of spread out like over millions and billions of years. And the name of this book is Last and First Men, written in 1930. Highly recommend it. Go out and get that. We may have existed on other worlds before, like billions of years ago, in some radically different biological form, and we may exist way in the future in some strange different form. And that is a fascinating, fun speculation. The reason why it's so fun, I think, for many of us, is if you think about human beings, since Protagoras in the ancient Greek world once said, "Man is the measure of all things," we've been sort of on a kind of philosophical ego trip. Protagoras was saying, this is back in like the 5th century before Christ, and Protagoras was saying human beings have a certain perception of the world and it makes their world. So reality is contingent on, how I see things. And we sort of adopted this kind of relativism. You'll hear people talk all the time about like, well, my truth is this, and somebody be like, well, my truth is that. Protagoras would have liked this because he thought truth was relative. There's no objective truth. And he was thinking about individuals. But then if you fast forward to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, you get a similar kind of view, which is human beings, maybe not individually are the measure of all things, but as a species, pretty awesome. The human nature has a certain kind of cognitive and perceptual ability, and we organize all of our experiences into laws of nature and sort of general values that we see when we look out into the world. And so reality is still shaped by the human mind. And you see that sort of coming to fruition in philosophers like Immanuel Kant, who says, there's a human nature and it filters reality so much so that we can never get around it to see what the reality is independent of us. And that's another way of saying man is the measure of all things, or humans are the measure of all things. So we've been on this kind of ego trip for, thousands of years. And what I love about the idea of panspermia and life coming from other worlds is it sort of asks us to think about human beings as maybe like we're lower down in the chain of intelligent life, and maybe we're just a much lower rung on the ladder than we thought we were. And that's a very sort of stimulating reflection, humbling for sure, but also fascinating. I mean, in a way, Darwin gave us this realization back in the 1850s when he publishes the Origin of Species. And in there, he sort of suggests, humans are just part of the evolutionary story too. And then very famously, he was sort of caricatured in a famous drawing. I think it was for Punch magazine, where there's basically like a sequence of these worms just slowly becoming mammals and then eventually becoming primates and then eventually becoming Darwin himself. It's a hilarious drawing. And it basically says, a man is but a worm. And that too is sort of dethroning us from this privileged position in all of nature and putting us sort of back in the mix of evolution. One of the reasons why we're interested in this again is because NASA launched in 2016 OSIRIS-REx, which is a craft that went to the asteroid belt and basically scraped the dirt off of asteroid Bennu. And this is amazing. I just wish, people would make more movies about that, because that's just shocking. You read it in the newspaper and you're like, what? Some craft goes to asteroid Bennu, which is sort of in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, and scrapes up the dirt and then brings it back. It leaves in 2016, it arrives at the asteroid in 2020, and then it gets back to Earth in 2023. And so just recently, scientists have been able to really process all of the data in that asteroid dirt, and what they found is shocking and fascinating, especially for the panspermia hypothesis. What they discovered was that in this dirt are many of the amino acids that make up protein. You need like 20 amino acids to make up protein, and something like 14 of the amino acids are in the dirt of Bennu. Furthermore, our DNA, as you know, is made up of these 4 amino acid base pairs, like you have adenine and thymine, guanine, and cytosine. And all 4 of those were discovered on the asteroid Bennu. That means all of the building block, the chemical building blocks for you and me, were already out there on this asteroid. And that means that the stuff of life is way more distributed than we had perhaps thought. And that means that if you could sort of combine that chemistry with something like the catalysts of water or sort of an energy source like heat, you might end up with life much more easily than we imagined before. Okay, now how could this happen? Well, in order for life and the ingredients of life to hitch a ride, we sort of have to study what are these strange objects that are moving through solar systems and through galaxies. And amazingly, we have just discovered a gigantic object that moved through our solar system called Oumuamua. And you might have seen this in the news. And if you're at all inclined, Paul Giamatti and I interviewed Avi Loeb, who's one of the Harvard astrophysicists that studied Oumuamua. Go and check out that interview in the podcast Chinwag. We have in fact, we have like a 2 or 3 part discussion with him about this stuff, and he's like a fascinating character. He and others noticed that it was very long and gigantic, bigger than any asteroid or comet that we have observed in our solar system, at least to date. And we didn't spot it until it was already moving away from Earth very rapidly. So we have not been able to get a whole lot of data on it. But wouldn't it have been great to send a robotic probe to go, just like in the case of asteroid Bennu, and scrape it or get on it and study it, maybe ride off into the sunset on Oumuamua? Yeah, you just need to put like a little robot on there, let it study Oumuamua and just send transmissions back to us until it eventually dies, in hundreds of years from now. Fascinating. Discoveries of objects like this really give much more credence to the idea of hitchhiker life, this idea of panspermia that's kind of accidentally just traveling around inside a solar system or inside a galaxy. So that has also sort of reactivated interest in panspermia. None of this sort of dry chemistry traveling around, on asteroids is going to work, however, unless you have the main ingredient of life, which is water. And water is absolutely crucial, as far as we can tell, for all of the sort of processes of life. And the reason, again, why we're getting excited about panspermia is because we have now, just recently, discovered water on Mars and on Europa. So in 2018, a group of Italian scientists were able to observe water on Mars. It's in an ice form, and it's near the polar cap, but giant lakes of ice on Mars. That is shocking and suggests that the main ingredient for life, water, is available on other planets within our own solar system, making, again, the probability of life very likely. Europa, you may recall, is one of the moons of Jupiter. It's one of the moons, actually, that Galileo discovered in 1610. That whole thing is always very exciting to me, that Galileo's using this crappy telescope and he can see just like 4 moons of Jupiter. And very famously, he's trying to get the cardinal to look into the telescope, and the cardinal, I think Bellarmine or something, says, "I refuse to look because this would controvert the Bible." I don't know how much of this is true. It appears in Bertolt Brecht's play Galileo, and it's kind of a great dramatic, point of tension between the church and the sciences. But in any case, it's amazing that Europa has only recently been discovered to also have water, and a lot of it, and it looks like it's liquid water. All of this stuff is making people look again at what is sometimes called the Urey-Miller experiment. Now, the Urey-Miller experiment was done at the University of Chicago, just down the street from me here, and it involved 2 figures, Stanley Miller and Harold Urey. The experiment took methane, ammonia, and hydrogen, put it inside imagine like a large test tube, a sort of glass enclosure, and then started zapping it with a kind of electrical arc to simulate lightning. And they just put it in there and let it bake, essentially, to see what would happen. And after a certain amount of time, they shut off the electricity and they sort of opened it up and they look in there and they discover and they start sort of measuring what they've got. And it looks like they've got a whole bunch of amino acids. And that was shocking. In fact, again, they had many of the amino acids that make up protein. And so there again, it looked like an experiment had shown a kind of abiogenesis theory to be very compelling, which is when you get the building blocks of life together, you add some kind of heat or some kind of electricity, and you have water, you're going to get something like organic pre-biological molecules. And that is, again, getting looked at as something that could be replicated. In fact, if you know of some experiments that are happening now, please put them in the comments because I love to follow this research. But if you know of some more recent work like this, please let us know. All of this reminds me of a professor I had when I was in graduate school named Sidney Fox. Sidney Fox was one of the first people to study the moon rocks when they came back from the lunar missions, from the moon missions. He was studying the surface of these rocks to see if he could find some of these amino acids or sort of protein-like molecules. And he also thought that there was a kind of abiogenesis, probably. And he wasn't thinking about panspermia. He was thinking this happened here on Earth. And if you look at some of these really extreme environments, like hydrothermal vents, volcanic events that are happening at the seafloor in the ocean, you'll see like there's water, there's chemistry, and then there's just like blasting molten lava coming out. And if you study that sort of crazy extreme environment now, you do find very strange multicellular life that can survive in these areas. And you also possibly have all the ingredients that you found in the Urey-Miller experiment for how life might have first emerged, because maybe this is what stuck together the elements to arrive at the first proteins. And once you've got proteins, then you need some kind of replicating mechanism, and life is off and running. The thing that Sidney Fox added to the discussion, which was really interesting, was he said, well, you can't just think, okay, how do we get DNA going? Because that's kind of like jumping from, like a junkyard to a Boeing 747. That's a huge jump in complexity and organization. And instead, he said, what if we look more closely at the cell wall? And so he said, if you get certain kind of proteins or proteinoid matter together and you add water, you can create these things he called microspheres. And he was able to do this in the lab. And he said, this has the same kind of protein structure as like a cell wall. So he was working sort of on lipid cell wall structure, while others are working on how do we get the first sort of bits of DNA or protein. And so that's an interesting question of which came first. It's like a chicken and egg question, because you need the cell wall to create all this metabolic activity within it so that it's protected and you can pass things between. But you also need the mechanisms inside that are reproducing. You need mitochondria. How did all those little bits and sort of pieces of just one cell get coordinated and organized into something that works? Because the thing has to work. It's not just like a jigsaw puzzle. It's a constantly interlocking, reproducing system that's functionally active. So that's one of the major mysteries about abiogenesis. You can't just say, well, we got the ingredients and therefore we've got life. There's a crazy distance of complexity and sort of functional activity between those two things. So one possibility then was sort of formulated by Lynn Margulis. And Lynn Margulis was a biologist who formulated this theory called symbiotic evolution. Endosymbiosis is how she referred to it. And when she first formulated it, she was basically laughed out of biology. I think she was attacked by like a dozen biology journals just attacked her theory. And she was a young biologist, and she was married to Carl Sagan. You may know that she and Carl Sagan had a child named Dorian Sagan. And Dorian Sagan is a very respected science writer today. Lynn Margulis formulated this idea of symbiosis, which said something like this. What if the complex cell, which has its nucleus and it has these mitochondria, or in the case of plants, it has chloroplasts, what if those were actually two much simpler organisms before, and they basically merged together into a symbiotic relationship, and then they co-evolved inside of each other? That seemed insane when she formulated the idea, and now we know that that is in fact true. She was totally vindicated, like in the 1990s, when we discovered through genetic analysis that, yeah, the mitochondria and the rest of the cell have kind of a different DNA history, and they live within each other, and that's what creates what we call the modern cell. And that's what all life, as far as we know, is based on. So that's very exciting and is sort of a bridge between that sort of dead inorganic stuff and life as we know it. Something like symbiotic evolution might have been exactly what was needed. Now, it's still super vague, but also very exciting. The important thing to remember now is that panspermia might be true, but it doesn't solve the origin of life problem. It just pushes the problem off to another planet. You could say, well, life did come from, accidentally from another planet, or it came intentionally by, an alien civilization sending it here. It's like the story of Prometheus or whatever, like the Alien franchise or Prometheus franchise in Hollywood also sort of toys with this idea. That's great, and that might be true, but you still have to tell sort of a scientific story about how life originated on that other planet. And that, again, is this weird gray area between the elements or materials of life and then the organization that's functional, that moves, that actually reproduces itself. And so there's basically sort of three main theories about this that have been alive and kicking for, I would say, really centuries, in some cases millennia. And the three are this. One is the abiogenesis we've been talking about. There's something self-organizing about matter itself, and this is called autopoiesis. Autopoiesis just translates as self-making. There's something about matter, it has certain kind of geometrical properties at the molecules, and when it locks together and you add a catalyst, it starts to bud or something like this, and then you start to get structures that can link together because of their structure. And as they do so, they're able to sort of process energy and have some kind of nutrition and excretion, and eventually you get processes of replication. Again, we do not understand how the self-organizing happens. We just have a huge promissory note that science is going to deliver on this. Two, something you're very familiar with, which is God did it. So that theory is basically intelligence from a divine intelligence of some kind, looks at the biological soup and then organizes it and structures it, and sort of, depending on how miracle-minded you are, breathes life into the clay or the stuff of life. And that is, if you set aside the religiosity of God, it's kind of just a way to solve a huge problem, which is how do you get the function and organization of life out of just the material parts. Maybe a designing mind or intelligence can do that. Why do we think that's possible? Because our minds can do that. The God argument is based on an analogy. I can take wood, well, not me because I'm incompetent, but somebody smarter than me can take wood from my backyard, chop it up, and make a chair. So my mind has the ability to take raw materials and turn it into something, and I can make machines. Again, not me, but better. My dad could have made a machine, but not me, alas. So we humans can make stuff that works like a living system in a way. So then we think maybe a divine mind did that to the universe in terms of life. And then the third option, not well known at all, but my favorite. And this is the idea that was very beloved by philosophers like Baruch Spinoza, but also Einstein really liked this idea that maybe instead of a God being like the guy that builds a chair, maybe God is inside all of nature and is sort of like a mind or a cognitive aspect. So the laws of nature really are God's mind. This is what Einstein said. And this is a very old tradition, not well known, and it's called the anima mundi, the soul of the world. And it goes way back to the ancients. Check out your Plotinus, and even maybe to some degree Plato. But it's the idea that the world itself has a soul or an intelligence in it, and it is the thing that's doing sort of complex organizing activities, at least at the beginning, to get it kick-started. So there you go. You've got chance, random self-organization plus natural selection, which produces a Darwinian view of life emerging from non-life. You've got the designer God, you've got your Yahweh making a God like in Genesis, and then you've got the anima mundi. All right, I think that's something to reflect on. Read your science fiction, read your science, and also stay up on your religion and your history of religion. A lot of great treasures in that stuff too. Okay, as always, stay curious, and I'll see you next time. Hey, Curiosifers, Stephen Asma here. Just a quick note to say thank you for all the wonderful feedback we've been getting on this crazy little show we're making. We are having a ball making it. And it's good to get feedback, and keep the comments coming, and also suggestions about future show ideas. We're reading the comments and we are taking them seriously. Also, it's really hard to play the bass and talk at the same time. It makes me wonder how Sting does it. Point is this, we also have a Patreon page. Head on over to Patreon, there's a link on our sort of front page of YouTube. And see, there's different levels that you can support us, and you get bonus material at the different levels, and also, you get special access to crazy ideas and unusual knowledge. So please avail yourself of that possibility. In the meantime, thanks again, and we'll see you back here next time. And remember, always stay curious.